let's talk about what works against it to kind of crush it or to keep it dormant, because I'm sure that the people that work against it and don't want that change understand how the radical imagination can empower people instead of have to work against it. Can we talk about that?
Sure. I think I'd point to three things. The first I point to is the mass media. I think since the end of the Second World War, arguably since the turn of the 20th century or even the 19th century, we've had a huge mass media machine, which really, in many ways, shapes our imaginations. The Hollywood industry of culture, the music industry, the news media, all of these industries are controlled very tightly by a handful of corporations. And those corporations are not completely against allowing any radical ideas in. There's some radical ideas that emerge from Hollywood. Sometimes radical ideas make it into popular songs. Occasionally, a radical theorist will make it onto the news media. But generally, they're interested in reproducing the status quo. They're interested in giving people the lowest common denominator. They're interested in sensationalism because first of all, because they're driven by commercial interests who just want to make money. And second of all, because they're often driven by very conservative interests who want the existing system to continue because it works really well for them. So that's the first blockage to the radical imagination I think I'd mentioned. The second one is history. I think that we don't know our history. We don't know the history of struggles. We're taught history as if it's the work of great men, usually great white men who went around the world and did wonderful things for people. But what we never learn in school, and what most people never even learn in university, is that for every incredible inventor, for every incredible military general or leader, there were millions of people struggling for this or that cause, for this or that movement. And that, in fact, there have been many moments in history where humanity could have taken other paths that, because they were subjugated or destroyed by the powerful, never got to bloom. We remember figures like Martin Luther or Martin Luther King, either the monk from the 16th century or the 20th century social movement leader. We think about these people as individuals who had these incredible effects on history. But in fact, they were just the tip of an iceberg of social movements, of huge upsurges. I mean, in the time of Martin Luther in the 16th century, for instance, and maybe I'm just thinking about this because I'm in Germany right now, most of Germany was in open revolt by peasants. Peasants were taking over whole cities and declaring them communes where they would share all property equally, as they imagined Jesus had instructed them in the Bible. This history is completely forgotten. Martin Luther was a conservative force at the time. He was a conservative who's now been taken to be this great radicalizer of history. Likewise, Martin Luther King, great orator, great leader, but the real organizing was happening on the community level, and the dreams of the community organizers were much larger and much broader even than King's own dream. So our view of history is limited. We remember history only as, this man did this thing, this man did this thing. We don't remember the women. We don't remember the enslaved people. We don't remember the workers. We don't remember all of the other people who contributed to that moment. And instead, we just get this triumphant narrative that would insist that all of history has simply led up to this present moment, as if the world that we live in now is the best world that could possibly have happened, and everything in the past was simply one step towards it.
What I would like, I want to break you right there and ask a question. I often speak about us not knowing the past, and then when the people who lived it and experienced it are no longer with us, how that shared experience kind of gets lost, and that means that past is open for reinterpretation. And even like they insert narratives and things that may not have even been there into that past to kind of change our interpretation of it and really affect where we are today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can look at a lot of the criticisms that have come from recent film representations of social movements in the past, whether, a good example is the film that was recently made about Stonewall, the great riot and uprising of queer folks in New York. And that film was very charismatic, it was very entertaining, but it completely erased the centrality of trans people and the centrality of people of color in that struggle. So you get this narrative that's now going to be taken as what really happened by millions of people who are going to see that film, that rewrites history in some way. And rewrites history towards kind of a very normal sort of idea of what needs to change in society. It becomes just a narrative of acceptance, or a narrative that doesn't really do justice to the complexities of our struggles today.
Yeah, I didn't want to derail you. You were going to talk about the third, but I had to say that because I would lose it, because each time you speak, it's like there's so much gold there.
Oh, thanks. The third thing I was going to mention is economics. And, you know, I'll just point to debt as one thing. I mean, I think that the biggest limit on our imaginations today is the fact that our imaginations are actually really hard at work, but not hard at work on things that we could do with them if we wanted to generate art or we wanted to generate social change. Instead, our imaginations are completely preoccupied with just surviving. I mean, I think there's an incredible amount of imagination in just how, like, people without money or people who are hugely in debt manage to, like, feed themselves and their families each day. It's almost impossible. I mean, people get really creative about how they're navigating a world of economic pain and torture, essentially. And I think one great example here is debt. So there's just a stat that was released a couple of days ago that the global debt load today is twice the economic productivity of the entire planet. So it would essentially take Earth 2 years of doing nothing but paying itself back in order to pay back all the debt people owe. And when you have a statistic like that, you have to wonder what's going on. I mean, that seems completely impossible. From an economics perspective and a financial perspective, it's largely possible. But on the other hand, there is a great work of the imagination going on that would allow us as a human species to organize our planetary resources on the basis of debt in this way. And let's remember, debt doesn't exist. Debt is a social institution. It doesn't exist in the physical world. It exists in the collective imagination. So we actually, as humans, and also as citizens of whatever country we're a citizen of, we are in fact committing our imaginations in some sense to this collective project of keeping debt alive. And I think this is what's preoccupying us. I mean, I think about my students, and student debt in Canada is by no means as terrible as it is in the United States, but it's bad still. People tend to graduate with $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in debt. This is what's consuming their imagination. And, you know, it's how am I going to pay back my loans? How am I going to get a job? How am I going to survive? Rather than what could I create? How could I contribute? How can I transform? So I think that just economics, and the economics especially of debt, are something that are really constraining and reshaping the imagination in incredibly negative ways.